God is so good, why are there so many bad Christians? Now, I think when I think about bad Christians or people accusing people of being bad Christians, often what they use is the word hypocrite. And I learned an interesting fact about that word this week.
Did you?
I did indeed.
Please
fact
share.
was that the word hypocrite actually comes from the Greek, and it's a Greek theatre term for the actors, because what it means is mask wearer. I'm holding this mask. It wasn't quite like this mask, but it meant mask wearer because they would portray a character or a person that they were not.
Interesting.
But we may discuss a little bit later on. Jesus took that word, and we see in the Bible that Jesus took that word and completely changed its context by how he used it. But we'll look at that a little bit later on.
So before we go any further, and I guess slightly on theme for what we're going to be talking about as the evening goes on, Josh asked me to read just a few verses from the Bible. And so I'm going to read from the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament. And so this is Jesus, and he is having dinner with people, with his friends, and if you read parts of the Bible with Jesus in, then he eats a lot with his friends, and this is just one particular occasion. So I'm going to read from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, verse 15. So while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were the Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners."
Thanks very much, Emma. And as we discuss a little bit later, we'll unpack that. But I found that verse was the starting point for my thinking when I was preparing for this evening. Bob, how are you doing? It's lovely to have you again. I've already said this, but here we are.
I'm fine.
Excellent.
I'm here in St John's, and I can hear and see you very well, Josh. That's good news.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So I've got a couple of questions for you here, Bob. Oh, here we go. Now we're playing with the delay of Zoom. I'm going to ask the first question to you here, Bob. Do you think that God expects us to get things right all the time?
It's a very good question, Josh, isn't it? I was thinking about this during the week when you asked me to think about this subject. And what I began to think about really was the unique perspective that the Bible gives us about the walk of faith. You know, so many books are written in a particular time context, but the amazing thing with the Bible is that we've got these different books that are assembled over many, many centuries. And so it gives us an insight into human nature and how people behave in different ways. And what you realize as you actually look at the individual stories about people and how they lived their lives, first of all, you realize that the Bible is incredibly honest. You know, so many in the world in which we live, often people talk about being economical with the truth or presenting yourself in the best possible way. I have to say, my reading of the Bible is that the authors present it warts and all. You see the good and the bad. And we could work our way through the entire Bible, but I think we will be asleep by the time.
Yes, we've got a little less time than that.
So I thought, how can we summarize that? And the passage that I thought about was the passage in a book called Hebrews from the New Testament, chapter 11. And it's about the heroes of faith. Have you read that chapter, Josh?
Yes, I have. I have in the past, and I did once you told me that that's what you'd like to talk about as well.
Well, the interesting thing is these are the men and women who've had a profound impact on preserving the Jewish faith, which was the if you like the bedrock of Christianity, how we understand where we've come from as believers. And actually, as you read through the list of that's in Hebrews 11, what you realise is that many of the people on the list had fairly serious things when done wrong in their life. They weren't a list of perfect people. And the one I thought would just mention as an example only really is King David, perhaps the most famous of all the people in the list, who we know as a wonderful warrior, a great king, a poet, a musician, a tremendously charismatic man who had a huge impact on his people. But also we know that he was an adulterer, a murderer. So you get these tremendous contrasts in character. And through the mistakes that he made, you remember how David would come back to God again and again in repentance, realizing the flaws in his own character and seeing how God forgave him, used him. And I think that really, in a way, is a template for all we've got to talk about tonight. It's not trying to think, how can I be perfect? But how can I, flawed as I am, by being obedient, recognizing mistakes, be more useful to God? And can he make me more like Jesus in that process? Perhaps I'm just a bad example, but it encouraged me. One of my favorite writers in the whole of the Bible is St. Paul. And in Romans 7, which is the chapter before, perhaps the chapter that's often regarded as the most powerful and important chapter in the whole of his writing, this Romans chapter 8, this is what he says in verse 18. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing. So this enormous man of faith who's had this incredibly intense experience of God speaking to him, challenging him, turning his life upside down. As he goes out to serve God on the mission field, he's really, really honest and just saying, I want to do, I know what I should be doing, but actually I get distracted. I often do the wrong thing. And at the end of the day, when I look back, perhaps I've not got it as good as I could have been. And so I think for all of us, that's encouraging. And of course, with the hindsight, we're looking back on his life. What an extraordinary life. This man who regarded himself as being flawed in many ways actually sowed so many seeds that have become the bedrock of faith right around the world. And how God uses us. I mean, when he was in prison, he used his time to write letters. And if he didn't, then probably we wouldn't have anywhere near the information about him that we have today.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point. And from the verse that I had Emma reading out before, that Jesus said, it's sick people that need doctors, not healthy ones. In the same way, as Christians, we're not saying that we are perfect, but it's quite the opposite, that we are accepting that we make mistakes and we're asking God to help us on that journey. Your thoughts, Emma?
No, and just, both of you have said it so well in that actually it's a really good job that God knows that we're flawed and that we're all flawed because, could you imagine if we just didn't realize how flawed we are? Like, it would just be awful. So, like, I agree with what Bob is saying, and that actually there is a comfort to know that we are all flawed, and that God knows that, and there is also bigger purpose within that, as well as kind of Bob has been saying.
Absolutely. I suppose we're talking about Jesus though here, and Jesus is 2,000 years ago. So is there, Bob, do you think that God has a plan and has made a way for that is still relevant to us today? Yeah,
I do. Yeah, very much so. One of the interesting things I was thinking about when people fail, and I think in the background of this question about bad people, as we think about what goes wrong, and if you look back at the headlines of where people actually fail in their life, it seemed to me that there were three key areas. One was money, the other was sex, and the third was power. And interesting enough, there's an American theologian called Richard Foster who wrote a book some years ago with that title, Money, Sex and Power. And I think what I really took from that book when I read it was that it's easy to see those things in a Christian perspective as all being negative things. But he was very clear in expressing that they were actually sacred, God-given things to us in order to order our lives appropriately. So he sees them as very much being good things, but good things that can be debased and abused. And I think that's a very interesting dichotomy that we have to deal with in so many things that have the potential to do good. So money that's given as a tithe or in generosity to a charity can actually advance and extend God's kingdom. But money that's used in other areas could be destructive to God's kingdom. It has that dual potentiality. Sex, which can be an enriching part of life in a permanent relationship, can also become an addiction and destroy both parties in an unsound and superficial relationship. So I think what we need to do is just thinking about the sacred and the spirit and the secular a little bit, begin to see that really all the things in life which can be seen as negatives also have the possibility of being sacred. And as Christians, that's a huge opportunity that we're given, because we suddenly see the things that could enslave us and restrict our freedom are actually opportunities to do the opposite, to release us and give us more freedom.
That's
Would you
really
agree? Would you agree with that, George?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For example, I know social media is a big one these days, where people are absolutely drawn in by the filtered nature, the perfect look, portraying, I suppose as we were saying before, as the hypocrite wears a mask to portray a character, where people use filters and such to portray their perfect life. But so it could be seen as really bad on that side of things. But equally, we use Facebook, we use YouTube to spread God's word and God's message, and so it can be used as a tool in that way as well. What do you think?
Well, it was actually making me think of a question actually when Bob was kind of talking there, in that, so taking the example of money, sex and power, and how they can be really used for God and for the glory of God, but they can also be used in a bad way. So do we think that it is our society and human nature that has twisted something that was originally intended for good and for God, and actually is our society that has twisted that? Or do we just think it is kind of, I don't know, evolution and just time going on? I'm not sure who. Bill, Bob. I'm missing Bill. Bob, what do you think? Has society twisted that, or do we think it's just the evolving? Sorry, I've jumped in with a question.
No,
but,
of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Emma. I think you've come up to a very important point there. It seems to me that in many of these areas, it feels like there's an enormous volume of voices presenting things in an inappropriate way, both in the publicity they get, the way they're expressed, dealing with it on a very superficial level rather than in the depth of what things really mean. And for Christians, it feels like we're almost whispering in the corner sometimes, that our voice is not being heard as an alternative way to live your life. And Christianity is often seen as being restrictive and life diminishing, whereas actually, my experience of those who follow Christ have their life expanded and their horizons expanded, and they have a greater sense of purpose and direction. And so how we get that message over against a tide of media, which is almost out of control now. And I think increasingly there is concern amongst politicians at the negative impact that some social media is having, simply because it doesn't have any breadth to it. You get groups that are like-minded, talking about the same things, and getting very locked into a mindset which is very narrow and doesn't hear the other voices. Yeah. Do you want to come in there, Joshua? As an expert in broadcasting and...
Well, I think... what was your original question? That's I was listening to Bob and I've kind of lost your original question.
So my original question was, in taking the example of money, sex and power, if they were originally intended for good with God, is it our society that has changed them and morphed them into something maybe more negative or bad, or is it just the evolution of life? Maybe.
I think the key thing to remember, as Bill and I were talking about suffering last week, is this element of free will, and God gives us free will to choose to live however we want. We can choose to live, and God would recommend that we live like Jesus, and he gives us that example in the Bible and in history. It's in a way to live that is pleasing to God, and as Bob has said, in loving God and loving others, those are the two things. I think Bob said that before the broadcast, actually. Mm-hmm. But Jesus summarizes all of God's law, particularly in the Old Testament, to say, love God and love others. These two fundamental things. And that's the way that God recommends that we live. But God doesn't force us to live this way. God says you can choose to live this way, or you can choose to live selfish. And unfortunately, some people choose to live selfishly. Some people choose to cause harm to other people. Some people, in this instance, choose to use money and power and lord it over other people, rather than seeing us as equals and using these things to build each other up. I've had a comment in, a nice thought from one of our viewers here this evening, talking about good and bad and where their moral compass is. Says, I think it's hard to know what is good and bad without God, as without him there's no moral absolute. So what does moral absolute mean?
Are you asking me that question?
I mean, I can aim it at you or Bob. Bob, would you like to come in on that? What does moral absolute mean in terms of determining good and bad?
We're moving to a world at the moment where people talk about their personal truth. This is my truth. Yeah. So that's a very interesting, because the problem we have is if your truth is different to my truth, and we're trying to do things together, the strain that can bring on the relationship and the confusion is enormous. So for most of modern history in Western Europe, we've lived within a Christian orthodoxy of, even where Christianity was not being followed, it was a cord that bound the laws together, informed the laws that we formed as a society. So there was a consistency of how people lived and behaved. As we move away from that, I think we're already starting to see quite a lot of tensions about what people believe to be right and wrong. And that's creating great ambiguity. And for Christians, obviously, the key verse is Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. So the absolute that Christians have is believing that in order to understand the sort of person we should be and the life that we should live, Jesus is the key reference point.
I think that's a perfectly adequate answer, isn't it?
I have nothing to add.
Yes, no further questions, Your Honour.
One of the points we talked about before the program, Josh, actually was that I'd looked up the number of laws that had been passed in the UK last year.
Wow.
Do you remember? There were nearly an average of nearly 10 a day. Over 3,500 laws were passed.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
incredible.
So the question was, does actually all of those laws really change the way people behave and act? And what you referred to before was the lovely saying from Jesus, which is his words were quoted in all of the Gospels, all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." And I've thought about that for a long time, because I think the bit that gets left out in our understanding is often loving ourselves. Where we have a deep awareness of our own frailty and failings, I think there's a sense for us to feel unworthy. And it's really important to know that Jesus demonstrated, as he did with the story of Levi you read earlier, he goes to the person who's living in sin and engages with them, starting to trigger this transformation in their character and in their behavior. And I think what changed Levi, what changed Zacchaeus, what changed the woman at the well, it was really Jesus engaging with them and actually seeing some value in them as a person, as people. And as he began to speak confidence into their life, then their healing comes, the transformation begins. And so for all of us to actually have that sense, when we look into our own conscience, into our own history, and see the flaws, to actually know that in spite of all those things, God and Jesus love us, and that is a beginning, as a new place, where we can begin again from that point, because that allows us to feel forgiven, and then to say, well, how do I want to live my life? What are the most important things for me? How can I be better? And I think the word you used in the introduction was transformation, or transformed, and I think that's what the Bible teaches. We don't get it right every day. We're not expected to by God. What he wants to see is us trying. And the other thing that's really helpful in that context is the Lord's Prayer, because it actually gives us a daily discipline in which every day we forgive those who've done things against us. We say sorry for the things that we've done. And in that release, our slate is wiped clean, and we can go into every day and knowing that we're in a strong position. We're forgiven. We have the freedom to live today better than we did yesterday and the day before, and tomorrow can be better still.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's an exciting widening horizons that free us up to be the people that God made, authentic and creative and full of life.
Yeah, that's really cool. And again, off that word transform, I was trying to think of the best way of describing it. And I don't know if you've ever seen the Transformers movies.
Well,
yes.
yeah, they're quite old now, aren't they?
They are a little bit.
Well, some of the originals are quite old.
Yeah, but certainly ones that I've enjoyed as a teenager when they started, I think. And I mean, there were TV shows even older than that, but I don't remember those. Back to the point. The Transformer, you may well have seen, is a truck or a car, and then it will reshape itself into a more human-like form. But what I love about it is the fact that it's still all of the truck or the car, all of the pieces, it's still the same color, but it's just rearranged into a different order. And I believe that that's what God does when he transforms us. He doesn't chuck us in the bin and start again. What he does is he teaches us how to position how we are and use our different skills and talents. And so he builds us into a completely different shape. My intonation didn't sound like I was ending, but I finished there.
That was really good. I actually really like that. I've never heard that kind of description before. But yeah, that's it's interesting, isn't it? That actually God isn't trying to make us someone that we're not. He's just taking who we are and shaping and molding and doing that type of thing. So he's not, it's quite a nice description.
Thanks. Good.
Don't be so surprised by the compliment.
Okay, we've got a question in here from one of our viewers. This question is, how do you deal with the disappointment and disillusionment that happens when a prominent Christian that you looked up to turns out to be fallen and to live a life very far from what you've expected? So not only is this a Christian that, so someone that is a follower, saying they're a follower of Jesus, and doing something clearly that isn't loving God and loving others. Mm-hmm. But not only that, but someone that you look up to.
Do you want me to answer that? Yeah,
please.
I think that's really, really hard. And I think when you watch something like that happen, it can be so discouraging and even a little bit heartbreaking, actually. Certainly if you look up to someone and they just don't turn out to be who you thought they were, I think that can cause you, I think, to question so much that you have heard from them, or that you have kind of maybe modeled a little bit of yourself off of. I think it pulls into a lot of questions, but I will say, as difficult as that is, I think, and I kind of want to address this in two ways, I guess, in that if it's that a Christian has made a mistake, but they are trying really hard to rectify that, even bring restitution where they're trying to make things right. So if you see that happening, I think we have to remember how human we are, and that Bob touched on this, in that we're very flawed. And I think we can recognize, or in our eyes, some mistakes are bigger than others, but we all make mistakes. So I think there has to be grace and understanding in that. But when someone doesn't just make a mistake, but chooses to walk away from God altogether, it's really, really heartbreaking, and sad. And for someone to watch that, and like I said, I think it pulls into question a lot of things, and I think that's a really huge question for such a short amount of time that we have. But one thing I will say is that people aren't God. So I have relationships with people, but my relationship with God is with God, not with another human being. So when I die and I go to heaven and I get to see God, that is dependent on my relationship with God, and accepting God and accepting Jesus as my Lord and Savior. So it is my relationship with God that saves me. So I think as much as we can find other people's actions hard, disheartening, even makes you question a whole lot of things yourself, your relationship with God, my relationship with God, is not dependent on other people. It is dependent on me and God. And I'm just aware that probably doesn't really scratch the surface on such a tough question. But your relationship is between you and God. And I think we see lots of people make lots of mistakes, and that is hard. But we're also not responsible for other people's decisions. And also, a mistake at one point in someone's life, and then even their choice to walk away from God, does not make everything good they did or everything inspiring they did null and void. it doesn't null and void it. It doesn't go, actually, but when they told me this or when they taught me that, well, that doesn't matter anymore because clearly they're failed at this. That doesn't null and void their past.
Yeah, because
it's just their present.
Yeah, because just because they've decided to stop following God doesn't mean that God doesn't exist anymore.
Yes, exactly. And it doesn't mean that God didn't use them previously as well. So I think we have to be careful not to brand someone's entire life by a decision that they make in a moment or for a season of life. But that's maybe not scratching the surface on this question. Sorry.
So quickly to follow that up, what does determine your relationship or help you in your relationship with God? How do you maintain your relationship with God?
Okay, how do I maintain my relationship? How do I maintain my relationship with God? I have to know Him. It's like with a human being. I have to know Him. So reading the Bible helps a lot with that. Praying helps a lot with that. The thing that even when people have betrayed me or I have felt hurt, really hurt by other Christians, how do I stay close to God? And I'm just going to backtrack a little bit, sorry. Quite a couple of years ago, someone asked me, they know quite a bit about my life and have known me for a long time, and they asked me, Emma, you've been really, really hurt by Christians in the past. So how do you stay so passionate about the church and walking the journey alongside Christians and investing in Christians? How do you stay so plugged in amongst Christians when Christians have hurt you so badly? And that is an excellent question, but my relationship with God is my relationship with God, not my relationship with man. And so when people hurt you, not God. You have to differentiate those, that when even when Christians hurt you, that doesn't mean that God is hurting you. That is people making choices to hurt you. And in those times, what keeps me close is I have to talk to Him. Clearly, I'm a talker. That's clearly part of my character, to be a talker. And I have to talk with God. And sometimes talking with God looks like shouting at God. Sometimes talking with God looks like crying my eyes out. Sometimes talking with God, communicating with God looks like singing to Him, and I can't sing to save my life. But that's what it looks like. It looks like spending time with Him. And in the times when I've had very few words, it means just sitting with God. There are times when I've sat there and I've just said, God, I don't know what to say. I just have no words for you, so I'm just going to sit. And sometimes just sitting with God is what it takes for me.
That's
sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. Really, really comprehensive. I've got another question here. Bob, I'll bring this one to you to give Emma's voice a rest. It says, tell us about how you discovered your own badness and how Jesus brings us out of that. Okay, this is a two-parter. In fact, we'll tackle the second part first and we'll come back to that other part. How do we, or you, welcome people back into church if they've been hurt by church?
Wow.
It's a big question, isn't it?
So you want to take the second part first, do you, Josh?
Yes. So if someone's been hurt by church, if someone's been hurt by church, how do we welcome them back?
I think normally it begins probably outside of church. Just thinking about the questions we're having about people who do go wrong in their life. I've known quite a number of people whose life has imploded and are normally very sorry about what's happening to them for a variety of reasons. They don't like the embarrassment, they don't like the attention, lots of things that they don't like. But also they have to face their own conscience, that inner voice. And in some ways it's very painful to look inwardly and see the things that you've done wrong. But also there's normally a sort of sense of great release because it's out in the open. And they've been living a false life. You talk about your masks at the beginning. So the inner reality of their life has been very different to the external presentation of how they present themselves, the image that they have. So whenever you get people to recognize that there are is that gap in who they are, to try and not to create a compromise, but actually to begin to describe a place where it's better to be, a new place, and how might they get there. So if they've been hurt by church or feel they're not worthy of church, you begin to explain to them how Christians need to be part of a body, that we're not individuals. We pray for our neighbours. They bring gifts and things to us that we don't have ourselves, and we experience life more fully together. And for a church, then we look at the endless examples of the Bible where God is patient with sinners. He may punish, but he also redeems. There's a lovely story that about a man called Chuck Colson. Have you ever heard about him? He was one of the 2 or 3 senior men in the White House under Richard Nixon in the early 1970s, and he was implicated deeply in the cover-up to the Watergate scandal when they broke into premises to steal documents. And he went to prison, and in prison he began to rethink about his own Christian faith and what he'd done, and it became a transforming experience for him. And from that was born a passion for prison reform, for taking faith into prison and sharing Christian faith with prisoners. And literally tens of thousands of lives in many, many countries of the world have been changed by that experience. In the Bible, Peter denies Jesus 3 times on the same evening. At the place when Jesus needed him to be a friend more than anybody else, he couldn't even do that. And yet Jesus soon after could say, Peter, you're the rock on which I will build my church. So the negative and the broken experiences of life are often the place where healing begins. And for many people, they are running away from the place of exposure, but when it comes, there is a place of redemption. The prodigal son is a wonderful story that Jesus told, which is exactly about this process of running away from God, running away from the comfort of the Father's house, and you get to a place where there's nowhere else to go, and then you want to come back. So how do we make that journey back? And of course, in the story of the prodigal son, it's the father is actually taking the initiative. As the son starts to come back, the father is going out looking for him, ready to welcome him, ready to celebrate that he's coming back. And I hope the churches that we belong to, and I think we do, we would have that sort of big-heartedness that where people have got it wrong, however bad it's been, that we would try and meet them on their journey towards us and help them to come back and to come back into a place of healing and a place where they can live fulfilled and useful lives and have learned from the mistakes they've made.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for your questions. I've got one more thought here from one of our viewers. It says, today's moral compass no longer points north. Relativism allows the needle to spin any which way. I totally agree with Bob's point. Jesus says, I am the way, and points the only way to God. And if we follow his path, we'll find real freedom and fulfillment. It's incredible. Wow. So many things this evening. Thank you very much, Bob, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. He may be looking a little frozen at the moment, but that's okay. We can still thank him anyway. Oh, there he is. He's back. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. Great to be with you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Emma, for helping me navigate. It's very very complex topic, isn't it? Very complex.
It was big. There were some good questions as well. There were some
excellent questions. And thank you so much for sending in your questions, for sending in your thoughts. One final thought was that Bill, who, if you watched Sunday Live, Bill sent in. He said he really liked the analogy of the transformer, which I'm quite pleased about because I didn't prep that at all. So I'm going to thank God on that one. And yes, it's a very important thing to know that God doesn't want to just chuck us in the bin and start again. God wants to use you for how He has made you to be. And it can be a long, slow process. If you've been hurt by Christians, then you can learn to forgive them, to love them, even though they may have chosen not to love you. That's certainly a challenge for the week, I suppose. Do feel free to join us again next week. We'd love to have you. We'll be back up in the loft, and we've got a special guest of Ruth Walker, and we're going to be looking at the question, can you really base your life on the Bible? As always, you can like, subscribe, tickle the notification bell, and we'll enjoy your company next week. So for now, goodbye and God bless.